talk about Kathi Appelt's new novel, Once Upon a Camel. Here it is. I have to get it in the view of the camera. Kathi is the author of over 50 books for children and young adults. She occasionally teaches at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and she lives with her husband, Ken, and their 5 gifted and talented cats. Kathi, let's start with the most obvious question.
Great.
You're a Texan, and most of your novels are set in Texas. Isn't that right?
That is true. Well, there's one exception, and that is one that I co-authored with Allison McGee, and it's set in Vermont, but that's an aberration. I can assure you I'm probably never going to write another novel set in Vermont.
Okay, the Texas landscape and culture gives your work so much of its distinctive flavor. And this one is a Texas story too, camels and all. So tell us, camels in Texas? I would love to know more about that history.
Well, first of all, thanks for asking that question. Thanks for doing this. I am a Texan. I wasn't born here, but I've been here most of my life. And to me, the 3 most important, I think, aspects of our lives in general are the people and the pets that we have and the place. The big P's as people, pets, and places, that have the most meaning in our lives. And so I tend to go to Texas in my stories because that's basically what I know. With this particular story, though, I was really out of my range because, as you know, Texas is a huge state, and the area that I live in is very humid. It's it's kind of a valley. It's flat. There's nothing really redeeming about it. But West Texas is it's so different. And so one of my desires to set a book out there is because it was so unique and different for me. It's really desert and mountains and, old lava beds, things like lots of cactus, things like that. So in a way, it was kind of like I really wanted to see that side of Texas in a more personal way. And so that's why West Texas and swamp. So I was kind of done with swamps. So there you have it.
But what about the history of camels in Texas? I think a lot of people don't know that there have been camels in Texas.
Yeah, it was years ago when I was a little girl. My grandfather actually told me that there were wild camels in Texas. And, for me, the idea of a wild camel, first of all, was farm animals as domestic, or a circus animal, an animal you might see, but never wild. And so, but, he was my grandfather, so why wouldn't there be wild camels in Texas? And then it wasn't until a few years ago that I just kind of, how it is, Marion, when you're researching one thing and something else comes up, and I just stumbled across an article about the camel experiment. In their desperate need to figure out a way to traverse the southwestern part of the country from Texas to California, basically, we're having a lot of problems with horses and mules because that area is so dry and rocky. It's really rough, deserty area. And so somebody said, why don't we try camels? And of all people, the person who really championed the camel experiment was Jefferson Davis of War at the time, before he became a big fat trader. And he was a keen supporter of the camel experiment. And part of why the experiment really faded was because after the war, nobody really wanted anything to do with Jefferson Davis. And so the camels, were basically disbanded, and most of them were sold to circuses or roadside attractions or miners. Miners used them as pack animals. And a few set out into the desert to fend for themselves, and those became the notorious wild camels of West Texas. So, and to this day, people claim they've seen one out there. Now, that would be highly unlikely, I think.
No proof that they really do exist.
Right. I mean, I guess it's possible. I guess anything's possible, but and people do claim, there are people, who own camels today who claim that their camel is a descendant of one of the, I don't know. I don't know if they can prove that or not. I don't think they had camel DNA testing back in 1850. but I was just fascinated by it. And so I thought, I'm going to do something with those camels. So yeah, it was one of those happy accidents.
That's intriguing. Now, would you read a couple pages? I want people to hear that rich storyteller's voice you've created.
Oh. Thank you. Yes, I would be happy to. In the book, and all you really need to know is Zada is the camel. She's the chief storyteller. And on her head are perched two baby birds. Their names are Wims and Beulah. And they're racing to escape a major windstorm called a haboob. And their parents, the little chicks' parents, have been blown off course. So they've been separated. And Zada is trying to so that's all to know. Okay. And they're perched between her ears on her head. From their spot on the top of her head, Beulah and Wims peered through Zada's thick fur. They stretched out their necks, but in the dimness, all they could see was the big absence left by their mother and father. Wims leaned sadly against his sister. I miss Mommy and Daddy, he whimpered. A tiny sniffle trickled from Beulah's beak. Me too, she said, baby cries. The other one can't help but join in. Wims burst into a mini rainstorm. So many tears, they flooded Zada's furry tuft. The two peeped and hiccuped and sobbed until the whole patch was in danger of turning into a swamp. Zada had to swallow hard to keep from unleashing her own tears. Missing. It's such a hard thing, isn't it? Zada wished she could say something that would make it all right or just a little bit better. It must have been a good wish, because right at the escarpment, dust all around, Zada could swear that she heard the faint ringing again, which made her think of Asiya. Ah, the stories we could tell, thought Zada, if only. Asiya, by the way, is Zada's old friend. There were so many things Zada couldn't do. She couldn't make the wind stop blowing. She couldn't keep the air from filling up with dust. She couldn't make the light return. She couldn't make Perlita and Pard reappear, no matter how much she wished. But stories, that she could do. Pip, pip, peepsters, Zada said as cheerily as possible. How can I tell you about two baby camels named Zada and Asiya with so much wailing and gnashing of beaks going on? There was a long moment of joint hiccuping, but at last, to Zada's relief, Beulah sucked in a big breath and wiped her face on her wing. Wims did the same, hiccup, followed by another sniffle, followed by both of them fluffing up their new feathers and scrunching down into tiny gray puffballs. I want to hear a story, said Beulah in her softest voice, and in a voice even softer than that. Me too, to which Wims added, but make sure it's not scary. Do we have an OOD, official okie dokie? There was no way to detect the baby caravanners' heads nodding up and down. Let the saga begin, she said. And with that, she used the most time-honored beginning of all great beginnings. And while maybe not the most original, when you are sheltering from a massive haboob with hopes that the local mountain lion was not in the near vicinity, who cared? Once upon a time, Zada began, in a land far away. So there you go.
That's just lovely. Listening to your voice brings me to a very writerly question. One
Thank you.
Strictly craft. I love your storyteller. That rich and humorous voice pulls me in, amuses me, fills me up. But your story moves between the events surrounding Zada, the camel, and the Kestrel family caught in the dust storm in Texas, and Zada's recounting the story of her own history. Yet you never leave your storyteller to switch into the first person Zada voice. I have no complaint. What you're doing works. But I'm curious, what made you decide to tell the entire story through your third person storyteller instead of having your camel speak in first person in those scenes?
I tell you, I struggled with that, Marion, really. I went back and forth with it because my natural instinct, my natural response really, when I first started writing it, when, Zada is saying, here, I'm going to tell you this story. And then going back, my first instinct was to write it in first person. This is what I did, this is what happened. But I really wanted to maintain a storyteller's voice, which, I feel like the third person is a traditional storytelling narrative. And so what I finally realized that I was doing was telescoping. So in the immediate story with the chicks, that lean in, that narrative was a little more it was a little more closely held. Embarks upon her part of the story, that older story, it's like it telescoped back. So it's like it was going in and out. And that allowed me to hold on to that omniscient storyteller that was actually telling the story. It's hard with third person to realize that, well, Zada wasn't really the narrator. There's a bigger there's a more omnipresent narrator. And so, but boy, I tell you, it was tough. It was hard to wrap my head around, because I kept wanting to slip into first person. So I kind of figured out, step back and tell this backstory, step forward and concentrate on the immediate story. That made it more manageable for me. But I tried it in first person.
and it just, sure you must have.
Yes. I think I tried second person at one time. I was just like, no, that's not going to do it. So,
okay, another question. I love your title.
And once I did also Reader.
See that?
That helped. It was tricky.
Yeah. I love your title, Once Upon a Camel. It's fresh and ancient at the same time. Do you have anything to tell us about how you came up with the title?
Desperation, actually. I'm terrible with titles. I just am. And so, yeah. But it made sense to me because I knew that one of the resounding themes of the story was going to be the power of story, and how stories save us, and they have that immense ability to rescue us. And I intentionally named her after Scheherazade as the chief, the best known storyteller ever of all time. And so, so it kind of made sense once I thought, well, once upon a time, and then I was just like, okay, well, there we go. Let's just do that. And especially since the little birds are upon a camel head. So I thought, well, that works. And fortunately, everybody seemed to like it, but I wish I was better with titles.
I don't think you could have been better on this one, that's for sure.
Thank you. I usually turn that job over to somebody else, to be honest. So I was, the fact that I came up with this was kind of amazing.
One of the greatest delights of this story, what I admire most, is your humor. The way you continually play with words, the wryness in that storyteller's voice that never falters. And about that, I have a question that probably says more about me than it does about you. How on earth do you sustain that delightfully light touch? When I'm lucky, I can introduce a chuckle here and there in the course of a story, but to keep it going, line after line, page after page, for more than 300 pages, I can't even imagine how you do that. Did you find it difficult to find that lightness of tone, or does it just come naturally to you?
If only it came naturally. That would be so great. Actually, it doesn't come that easily. I mean, I think humor is really hard. For one thing, and I discovered this when I was writing True Blue Scouts of Sugarman Swamp, humor, there's a very, very fine line between funny and stupid. And who wants to be stupid? Of course, thousands of second grade love stupid, right? I mean, and girls too, for that matter. All of us enjoy, something that's kind of stupid once in a while. But I, as an author, there's a very thin line there, between what is funny and what is kind of stupid. And so, and a lot of it is just kind of trial and error. But the thing about this particular book, I wrote it during the pandemic. It's always going to be my pandemic novel. And there were the world around, it was hard to find funny. It was hard to find joy. Mm-hmm. And so I remembered somebody, I don't even know, maybe it was Aristotle, who said that comedy is really the ultimate expression of tragedy. And so, and I felt that at a kind of a visceral level while I was working. And so there were all kinds of issues, aside from the virus, there was child separation. Well, I had that in my book. Mm-hmm. With the parents being separated from the little green in place. Well, I had that in the book. There was climate change with the enormous dust storm. So that was also, so I had I realized I had all of these things in there. And I realized, for us to cope, we have to have light. There has to be light. If you just have unrelenting darkness, it becomes first melodramatic, but then it becomes too much to bear. And so I really, as I turned, was in wordplay, just using alliteration as much as I could, and assonance, and just, things that were really light in my ear as much as anything, to try to up the humor level of it. And I also just tried to remember what it was like to have toddlers, and how aggravating and delightful and all of that, that goes with toddlers. And that was helpful. That was really helpful, actually. So that's not a very good explanation, but there.
I think you remembered toddlers very well. There are a number of scenes with those young birds that took me back to those days of mothering.
I know.
Fiction often requires research, and setting any story in the past requires even more. As I was reading, I found myself noting all you must have had to learn to be able to tell this story. Will you tell us about your research?
Well, the first thing I did is I started, I just went online and started Googling the U.S. Army Camel Corps, and there's actually quite a few novels and things out there about them. But fortunately for me, one of the things that I found, I'm sorry, my phone just rang. I'm going to turn it off. With the camel experiment, there was the man who was ultimately in charge of it, a man named Beale, or if he wasn't in charge of it, he was co-commander or whatever, kept a journal. So, what every researcher dreams of is original materials, is that firsthand accounting, and there was one. And so, all this stuff about the ship and the, and even after the experiment ended, this man, Mr. Beale, of the camels, he lived in California and he kept quite a few of them. He really loved the camels. And so I had this really wonderful journal that he kept, and it's published. It's still available. You can buy it. And so there was that. There's a handful of books that have been written about the camels. Some of them more reliable than others. And there were some supposed firsthand accounts about them. As interesting as the camels, though, was about Turkey, because over and over again, when I was researching, it talked about how, this group of men went to the Middle East to purchase camels to bring back to Texas. And so, they knowing nothing about camels, they kind of had to rely on the local camel dealers. And some of the camels they got were better than others, let's say. But when they got to Turkey, to Smyrna, the Pasha charge of the city, or the city state, gifted the army with 9 really wonderful camels, and they were the best that that the group was able to get to bring back in the original group. And so I thought that was fascinating that the rest of the dealers wanted to sell them, of course, and make some money, but the Pasha gifted them. It was a gift to the young country, because it took place in the 1850s. So do a little research on Smyrna. Well, it turns out I kept like Googling Smyrna, and this, Greece would show up, but not Turkey. And it turns out that in 1922, there was a major fire, which, was had all kinds of, that's another whole story, but they changed the name of the city to Izmir. And so once I figured out, oh, okay, I'm looking at the wrong name for this town, this city. Off the bat was interesting to me, but just, I had to figure out the countryside and learn a little bit, because originally I thought Turkey would be a lot like West Texas, deserty, and but it turns out it wasn't so much. They're not all that much alike. And so, but I so wish I could go. I would really love to go to Turkey. I don't think it's a super great place to travel right now, but one day I would really like to go, especially to see this place called Cappadocia with fairy chimneys. That appeals to me in a huge way. And so so the research, and of course the camels themselves, I did go on a camel ride to figure out, so that I could experience it firsthand. And I watched tons of videos about camels. So I'm kind of in love with them, to be honest.
Okay, let's move from research to characters. We writers always choose our characters with great care. Each one must have some kind of heart connection for us to be able to bring them to life on the page. So, why are the secondary characters in your story kestrels? Do you have a particular connection with those birds, or did choosing them as your secondary characters simply suit the needs of the story you were telling?
In honesty, they basically suited the needs of the story. I needed small birds because I knew they were going to be perched on the head of the camel. I originally set out, I started researching the region, what birds were actually in Big Bend along the southern part, southwestern part of Texas. And originally I wanted them to be elf owls because they're so small, the little elf owls, they're tiny, they're like an inch high, they're teeny little things. But as it turns out, the elf owls are migratory. So I was having, within the timing of the story, I was having trouble as far as what season there would be a haboob, for example, and would that work out with the nesting habits and then the migration of an elf owl. And so I thought I really want a bird that stays put, that is there all year, that doesn't migrate. And so the next, a very small bird was the kestrel. And the American kestrel, they're the smallest of the falcon family. They really are tiny. But as it turned out, they became the perfect. They're protective. They're really cute. They make these really wonderful sounds, and so the kestrels turned out to be really, really wonderful choice. The other thing about owls is, I really wanted to be respectful of the inhabitants of that area. And of course that area, even though it's all desert, has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. And all of them, but some of them really object to owls. And so even though my story is really not certainly not a Native American story, but I did want to be respectful of that sensibility and save the owls for another story, maybe. I don't know. They're really wonderful, the little owls. But and the other thing about the owls is they tend to live in saguaro cactus, and it turns out that there aren't any saguaro cactus, and the saguaros are all in Arizona and New Mexico, not Texas.
I've seen
so that was a surprise to me.
In the cactus,
yeah, they tend to nest in cactus, and so and since there aren't any saguaro cactus in West Texas, that also didn't work. So so the kestrels turned out to be perfect.
You mentioned the sounds the kestrel makes and what a nice sound it is. People who haven't read the book yet won't know this, but all the way through you're depicting sounds, animal sounds, wind sounds, various kinds of sounds, finding words for the sounds, and they're just wonderful. That must have been, and they change, they're different. You aren't using the same kind of consonants and same kind of combination of letters for different sounds. How did you do that, and how did you keep track of what sound you had given this as to what sound you'd given that, and how did you manage to take the sound and turn it into letters?
I kind of made a directory. I made a kind of directory, for each animal of what their sounds are, and I tried to be as I don't know, I guess with like the kestrels, their sounds are they have that k sound that they make clees and killies and very high pitched sounds to kind of match their name, and the camel was a little different because they're more of a deep guttural, their noises are much deeper, more like the closest I can think of that they are is like a brain of a mule or something like that. It's a little deeper sound than that, but the camels' sounds are kind of all over the chart. It's almost like every camel has their own unique sound, but at the end of the day, they're sort of guttural. And then the wind, that's, I just try to kind of whoosh it as much as I could with the wind. I did a lot of research on different names for wind, which I think is really cool. So I'm gonna have to write a wind story at some point.
I'll be waiting for your wind story, Kathi.
Yeah, you can call me Windy. Sometimes I am pretty windy.
Finally, by the time any story arrives in the world as a book, it has been out of the author's hands for a long time, which means I'm guessing you have another manuscript underway by now. Would you like to tell us about that?
Well, that would be wishful thinking on my part and your part. I wish that I had another manuscript underway. I mean, I'm at that, I always in between projects feel a little floaty, like a little unmoored. I don't know if you feel that way. Marion, I doubt it because you're always working on a project, but I feel a little untethered right now. Commit. I've got these images, and for me, stories do start with images, and so I have several of those, but I haven't committed yet. And so that is my next goal, is within the next little while to actually make a commitment and get busy. Been sort of resting on my laurels, if you want to know.
I'm glad you can do that. My problem is that I have difficulty doing that.
Well, I should be a little farther along, honestly, but I have a couple of starts, but nothing that like I said, I've committed to. And so, and do you ever find that where you have like a start and you're like, oh, do I really want to commit to this? So for me, it always comes as kind of a tug. I'll start something and then finally I'll feel a tug, like, okay, we need to go ahead and do this. Mm-hmm. I haven't felt that tug yet. So.
All right. This has been a wonderful conversation, Kathi, about a wonderful book. And I know everybody listening is going to want to run right out and get it from their library or bookstore and sit down and immerse themselves in your camel and your kestrels and your West Texas desert, and just in your wonderful storyteller's voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marion. I so appreciate it.